The night began like any other in the quiet Midwestern neighborhood. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the streets were still, bathed in the glow of porch lights and the occasional passing car. Families were settling in for the evening. Televisions hummed softly through windows, and the world seemed at peace. But inside a modest two-story home on the corner of Pine Street, that peace was broken by raised voices, the sound of breaking glass, and the piercing cry of a child. Neighbors had learned to ignore the occasional arguments from that house. They had grown used to the muffled shouting that sometimes leaked into the night air, but this time was different. The sounds weren't muffled. They were sharp, violent, and relentless. One neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Allen, stood at her window clutching her phone, torn between minding her own business and calling for help. When she heard the unmistakable shriek of a child, a sound that cut to the bone, she didn't hesitate. She dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice answered, 911, what's your emergency? There's something happening across the street. Mrs. Allen whispered urgently, her voice trembling. It's the Johnson house. He's shouting again, louder this time. I heard glass break, and the little girl, oh God, she's crying. Please send someone. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights shattered the quiet calm of Pine Street. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, engines humming, radios crackling. Officer Daniels, a seasoned patrolman with 10 years on the force, stepped out, first scanning the house. His partner, Officer Ramirez, younger but sharp, followed close behind. Both men approached the front door cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the shadows of the porch. Inside, the scene was one of chaos. The living room was in shambles. A lamp lay shattered in the corner, its bulb flickering weakly. A picture frame, once hanging neatly on the wall, was smashed on the floor, the smiling faces inside now obscured by broken glass. The smell of spilled alcohol hung heavy in the air, and in the middle of it all sat a small girl, no older than 3. She was huddled in the corner near the sofa, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her wide eyes were wet with tears, her tiny chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. She said nothing. She didn't scream or call out. She just stared at the basement door across the room, as if it were alive, as if it held something she couldn't speak of. Sir, step away from the child. Officer Daniels barked. The father, a tall man with unkempt hair and wild eyes, stood near the kitchen doorway, his chest heaving. He raised his hands slowly, though his expression carried more annoyance than fear. This isn't what it looks like, he muttered, his words slurred with drink. She just fell. Kids cry, that's what they do. But the officers weren't convinced. They had seen too many scenes like this before, too many excuses wrapped in denial. Ramirez moved toward the girl carefully, crouching low to meet her eye level. Hey, sweetheart, he whispered gently. You're okay now. We're too. Help. The girl didn't answer. She didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the basement door. Daniels followed her eyes. Something about the way she stared at that door unsettled him. He noticed how her tiny body shook when a gust of wind rattled it against its frame, as though the sound alone carried memories too heavy for her small shoulders. He exchanged a look with Ramirez. Both men felt that something more was going on here. The decision to check the basement came quickly. Ramirez tried the doorknob. Locked. Daniels knocked on it with his flashlight. What's down here? He asked the father. Storage, the man snapped, his tone sharp. Old junk. There's nothing down there. But his answer came too quickly, too defensive. Daniel's instincts, honed by years of responding to the unexpected, told him otherwise. He radioed for backup, requesting a K-9 unit. Minutes later, The sound of paws clicking against the pavement echoed in the night as Rex, a German shepherd with a reputation for fearless precision, bounded up the steps. His handler, Officer Miller, gave a brief nod before commanding the dog toward the house. The moment Rex entered, his nose twitched, his ears perked, and he pulled forward with an intensity that left no doubt. He lunged at the basement door, barking furiously, his claws raking the wood. The girl whimpered and clutched her rabbit tighter. She didn't cry out, but her gaze sharpened. Her eyes seemed to say, "They'll find it now." Daniels kicked the door once hard. The frame cracked, but it held. Miller called Rex back as Ramirez moved in with a pry bar from the squad car. With one final push, the door swung open, and the officers descended into darkness. The basement smelled of damp earth and neglect. Dust floated in the beam of their flashlights, swirling like tiny ghosts. But the shadows revealed more than just cobwebs and forgotten boxes. Lining the walls were items that shouldn't have been there, stacks of electronics still in their packaging, tools with serial numbers scratched off, and boxes filled with documents. In the far corner, covered partially with a tarp, lay something even more disturbing: photographs, dozens of them. Some appeared innocent enough scenes of city streets, backyards, and cars parked at night. But others made the officers' stomachs twist. Images of people taken without their knowledge, faces caught in grainy black and white through telephoto lenses. And then there were the weapons. Several handguns, a shotgun, even what looked like homemade explosives, half finished and stored recklessly. Among the clutter dot, it was enough. More than enough. Daniels exhaled, a knot tightening in his chest. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was something bigger, darker, something the little girl had lived beside every day without understanding. Back upstairs, Ramirez lifted the child into his arms, speaking softly. "You're safe now. We've got you." She buried her face into his uniform, clutching the rabbit between them. For the first time that night, she closed her eyes. Outside, the father shouted protests as officers cuffed him and led him to the cruiser. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering, horrified at what they were seeing. The flashing lights painted the street in red and blue, casting long, distorted shadows. But even in the chaos, the girl remained silent. She said nothing as the officers placed her gently in the back of another car. Nothing as the social worker leaned in to reassure her, and nothing as the cruisers pulled away into the night. Only her eyes spoke, wide and knowing. Glancing once more at the house she was leaving behind, it would be days, weeks even, before anyone realized just how much she understood. And it would all come crashing into the open the day she pointed her finger at Rex in a crowded courtroom and whispered two words that would silence an entire room. The night air was heavy when Rex barked at the basement door, his deep growl reverberating through the house like a warning bell. The German shepherd was relentless, his paws scraping at the wood, his hackles raised. The little girl still curled on the couch, clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her eyes flicking nervously between the door and the police officers. She didn't speak, but her trembling body said enough. She knew. Officer Miller tightened his grip on Rex's leash. He had worked with the K-9 for years, trusted his instincts more than most humans. "He's on to something," Miller muttered, his voice low but steady. Officer Daniels nodded grimly. They forced the door open after several attempts, the wood splintering beneath the blows. A thick, damp odor rolled up from the darkness below. It was the smell of mold, earth, and something else, something metallic, acrid, unsettling. Daniels descended first, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, Ramirez and Miller following close behind. Rex lunged forward eagerly, nose twitching, ears forward. The basement revealed itself slowly under the pale light. At first glance, it looked like storage boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture pushed against the walls. But as their eyes adjusted, the details came into focus, and those details painted a far darker picture. One wall was lined with electronics. Televisions, laptops, cameras, still in their boxes, some bearing security tags ripped from stores. Another corner held crates of tools, power drills, bolt cutters, crowbars, items useful not for home improvement, but for breaking and entering. On a rickety table sat stacks of driver's licenses, credit cards, and identification documents, many with photos that didn't match the names. The realization hit Ramirez first. Identity theft, he whispered. He's been running scams. But it wasn't just fraud. Daniel's flashlight swept further into the room, revealing a collection of weapons. Pistols, rifles, a shotgun. Some were clean and polished, others wrapped in cloth as though recently handled. Near them were boxes of ammunition, stacked high like a fortress of intent. And then, most chilling of all, they spotted a small collection of makeshift devices. Glass bottles with rags stuffed inside, chemical containers labeled with warnings, wires, and timers scattered across a bench. Homemade explosives, Miller muttered, his throat tightening. He pulled Rex back slightly, wary of what might be unstable. Daniels crouched near the far wall, where photographs had been pinned haphazardly. They were printed on glossy paper, some enlarged, others cropped. Faces stared back at him, unwitting strangers caught in the lens. A man leaving his office. A woman walking her dog. Children at a playground. All taken from a distance, long lens shots, many clearly without the subject's knowledge. Daniels felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just criminal behavior. This was obsession. Behind him, Ramirez lifted a small metal box and opened it carefully. Inside were more photographs, bundled with rubber bands, alongside notebooks filled with scribbled notes, addresses, times, routines. He's been following people, Ramirez said, his voice hushed as though speaking louder might make it worse. The air grew heavier with every discovery. This wasn't a simple domestic case anymore. It was a web of crime that stretched far beyond the walls of the house. Daniels radioed in immediately, his voice steady but urgent. We've got a situation here. Weapons, explosives, stolen property. Requesting detectives, bomb squad, and child services. This is bigger than we thought. While backup was en route, the officers continued to catalog the basement visually, careful not to touch anything unstable. Rex growled again, pulling Miller toward a large trunk shoved under the stairs. With effort, Daniels and Ramirez dragged it out. The lock was heavy, industrial. They forced it open with a crowbar. Inside lay more evidence. Cash bundles wrapped in elastic, passports with different names, and several cell phones. Each one powered off, each one holding untold secrets. Daniels held one up, his face grim. He's not just a petty thief. This is organized. Above them, faint footsteps echoed, the father pacing upstairs, handcuffed but restless under the watch of another officer. His muffled curses carried through the floorboards. He knew what they were finding. He knew his life was unraveling with every second. Meanwhile, the little girl hadn't moved much from her spot on the couch. Her wide eyes followed the officers whenever they came back up, but she never spoke. When Rex emerged from the basement, his fur dusted with cobwebs, she watched him closely. For a moment, her lips parted as though she wanted to say something. But instead, she hugged her rabbit tighter and lowered her gaze. The scene became a hive of activity as more units arrived. Detectives swarmed the basement, photographing, bagging, documenting everything. The bomb squad moved cautiously, examining the makeshift explosives with precise hands. Social workers entered to care for the child, coaxing her gently to leave. the couch and come with them. But one thing lingered in everyone's mind. What had this child seen? How much had she witnessed, night after night, growing up in a house filled with secrets, lies, and danger? Her silence seemed heavier than words. As the evidence piled up, the case against the father grew airtight. The stolen goods, the weapons, the surveillance photos, all of it painted a picture of a man living a double life, hiding behind the facade of an ordinary home. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief as they watched from their porches, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster uncovered inside. Yet amid the chaos and discovery, one detail stood out above all: the way the girl's gaze had fixed on Rex, the K9, the moment he entered. As though she had always known he was the key. As though, in her silent, childlike way, she had been waiting for him to unlock the truth. It would be a long road from here: court dates, evidence hearings, media coverage. But the officers who descended into that basement would never forget the smell, the sight, the sheer scope of what they uncovered. And they would never forget the little girl, silent and small, whose presence had sparked the unraveling of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. For now, though, the house on Pine Street stood as both a crime scene and a reminder. Sometimes the most innocent eyes see the darkest truths. And those truths, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. The weeks that followed the discovery were a whirlwind of activity. Courtrooms, social workers, and detectives became a constant presence in the little girl's life. The father had been arrested immediately after the basement was secured, handcuffed, and transported under heavy police escort. Every piece of evidence, the stolen property, the weapons, the surveillance photos, the makeshift explosives, was carefully cataloged and stored, ready for the courtroom. But while the adults scrambled to process the facts and prepare legal strategies, the most vulnerable participant, the 3-year-old girl, became the quiet center of the storm. She was placed under protective custody almost immediately. Social. Workers described her as withdrawn and cautious. She rarely spoke, clutching the worn stuffed rabbit she had carried throughout the chaos of that fateful night. For the officers who had been on the scene, her silence was haunting. For the detectives building the case, it was a stark reminder of the human consequences behind the files, photographs, and weapons. And for the prosecutors, it was a puzzle. How could a child so young become part of a case so enormous without being harmed by it? Meanwhile, the father sat in a jail cell, his public defender working to assess the mountain of evidence. He maintained a facade of calm, insisting to anyone who would listen that his daughter's presence in the case was irrelevant, that the photographs were innocent, and that the weapons were for protection. But behind closed doors, the man was unraveling. He knew what was coming, and deep down, he understood the girl had seen more than he could control. Every night, he replayed the moment the officers had found the basement, imagining what she must have felt. Back at the courthouse, the prosecutors convened to strategize. Lead prosecutor Ellen Harris, a woman known for her meticulous attention to detail, pored over every photograph, every notation from the detectives, and every piece of evidence from the basement. This case isn't just about theft or illegal possession, she told her team. It's about establishing a clear pattern of danger. And the girl's testimony or presence cannot be underestimated, even if it's not formal testimony. Her reactions, her behavior, all of it is part of the record. The defense attorney, a sharp and seasoned lawyer named Marcus Livingston, countered with equal precision. We must argue that her age and understanding are insufficient for this courtroom. Emotional influence cannot replace admissible evidence. This child's presence is a double-edged sword. The jury may sympathize with her, yes, but we will ensure the focus remains on facts, not theatrics. Amid these legal maneuvers, the little girl remained in foster care, moving from one quiet home to another. Each night, she clutched her rabbit as she drifted into uneasy sleep, haunted by images she couldn't fully comprehend. Social workers worked tirelessly to provide reassurance, to create a sense of normalcy in a life that had been anything but. Yet in every session, the girl's eyes betrayed something profound. She had seen something adults might never fully understand, and that vision would inevitably resurface when the time came. The days grew into weeks. The courtroom was scheduled, and media attention began to build. Reporters arrived, filing stories about the raid, the discovery of weapons, and the father's past criminal record. The story had all the elements of a national headline, a frightened child, a hidden cache of weapons, a K-9 hero, and a father who had lived a double life. Yet no one outside the courtroom could know the silent, invisible role the little girl played in shaping the perception of what had truly happened. As the first court date approached, the prosecutor and detectives conducted a careful review of the child's potential involvement. They were acutely aware that anything she said, any gesture she made, would be dissected by the media and the jury alike. To prepare, they engaged child psychologists who specialized in trauma and legal testimony. The professionals recommended minimal direct questioning, allowing her presence and natural reactions to speak volumes. They emphasized that her well-being was paramount, and any attempt to pressure her could destroy both her trust and her innocence. The defense, meanwhile, sought to limit her exposure. They filed motions requesting that she not appear in the courtroom, citing her age and emotional fragility. Livingston argued that any interaction with her father in that environment could be construed as leading the jury emotionally, rather than presenting factual evidence. It was a tactical move, but it underscored a chilling reality. Even in cases involving clear criminal activity, the innocence of a child could become a battlefield. Despite the legal wrangling, the girl remained silent, observing the adults around her with quiet intelligence. Foster parents noted that she often stared at law enforcement officers, as though measuring their intentions, her gaze unwavering. Even social workers remarked on her uncanny perception, the way she seemed to understand far more than a typical 3-year-old. It was as though the chaos of that night had carved a permanent impression on her psyche, one that no comforting words or toys could erase. The police dog, Rex, became a subtle yet constant presence in the preparations. The officers ensured he was included in the demonstration that would be part of the courtroom evidence. Rex's role was crucial. Not only had he discovered the hidden basement, but he had also provided a sense of safety to the child in that moment of terror. His trained behavior and instinctive courage would serve as a silent testament to the chain of events, a living piece of evidence that transcended paperwork and testimony. As the trial date drew closer, the tension among the adults involved reached a peak. The courthouse seemed to buzz with anticipation. Every procedural detail mattered, every witness statement was scrutinized, and every possible outcome weighed. And all the while, the girl's quiet presence hovered at the center, unseen yet profoundly influential. Her silence, her gestures, and her reactions were pieces of a puzzle that no one could fully articulate, yet everyone sensed their significance. The father, sitting in his cell, began to feel the pressure. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He knew that the evidence was overwhelming, and that the little girl had been a witness, in her own way, to every secret he had tried to hide. He had underestimated her, underestimated the power of innocence combined with instinct. And as the days ticked closer to the trial, the gnawing sense of dread grew heavier, a shadow that would not lift. Finally, the night before the trial, the courthouse emptied into silence. Prosecutors reviewed their files one last time. Defense attorneys rehearsed objections, and social workers prepared the child for the day ahead. The girl slept fitfully in her foster home, hugging her rabbit, her small body curled into a protective shell. Dreams, if they came at all, were likely filled with fragments of the basement, of the flashing lights, of the barking dog. She didn't know it yet, but her role in the story was about to become impossible to ignore. And somewhere in the city, Rex rested at the K9 unit station, ears twitching, paws stretched, unaware of the drama yet to unfold. He had no understanding of legal systems or courtrooms, but his instincts had already shaped the course of events. And in the quiet stillness of that night, the stage was set for a courtroom moment that no one would forget. A tiny girl, a courageous dog, and the truth that had waited silently in the shadows for far too long. Tomorrow, the trial would begin. The public would see the evidence. But what they could never fully grasp was the quiet, piercing presence of a 3-year-old girl whose life had been altered forever, whose innocence had become the unexpected fulcrum upon which justice would balance. And in the stillness of the night, before the courthouse doors opened, everyone involved, lawyers, detectives, foster parents, even the father, felt a common, unspoken truth. The smallest witness could have the loudest voice. The morning of the trial arrived like a storm disguised as sunlight. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp but tense. Reporters jostled for positions, microphones poised, cameras ready to capture every detail. Uniformed officers directed traffic and maintained a cautious perimeter, ensuring the high-profile case didn't erupt into chaos before it even began. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, polished to perfection, reflecting the anxiety radiating from every corner. The walls seemed to hum with anticipation, their solemn authority only heightening the weight of the day. Inside the courtroom, the scene was already electric with tension. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience and a reputation for impartiality, presided at her elevated bench, her gavel resting nearby like a silent sentinel. Her eyes scanned the assembled crowd, taking in attorneys, officers, social workers, and the jury. Each person carried the invisible burden of responsibility, the prosecutor to prove guilt beyond doubt, the defense to fight for fairness, and the jurors to balance the scales of justice with impartiality. At the front, the prosecution team arranged their evidence meticulously. Photographs, notebooks, weapons, and boxes of documents from the basement raid. Lead prosecutor Ellen Harris moved carefully among her colleagues, checking that every file was in order, every exhibit labeled and ready for presentation. Her mind, however, kept returning to the girl. She would be present in the courtroom, not to testify formally, but her behavior, her reactions, her mere presence, would inevitably influence everyone in the room. Harris knew that a 3-year-old could wield power far beyond her years. The defense table mirrored the tension, though, in a different shade. Marcus Livingston, the father's attorney, reviewed legal notes and objections, occasionally casting a calculated glance toward the jury. He was aware that public sympathy could be dangerous, that jurors might respond not to facts but to emotion, especially in cases involving children. His strategy was clear: minimize the girl's exposure, control the narrative, and focus solely on discrediting circumstantial evidence. Yet even he could not ignore the undercurrent in the room, the quiet, almost imperceptible attention that followed the child wherever she went. When the father was escorted into the courtroom, his expression was unreadable. His eyes flicked briefly toward the jury, toward his attorney, and finally, toward his daughter, who sat in the designated safe space, flanked by a social worker. He blinked rapidly, as though the bright lights and the attention were new weapons, aiming to break him. He had been imprisoned in fear before, but nothing in the cell could have prepared him for the scrutiny of the human gaze, concentrated in one room, magnified by a child's unfiltered perception. The little girl, perched on a booster seat, held her stuffed rabbit tightly. Her wide eyes darted from the judge to her father, then to the officers, and finally to Rex, who waited silently near the evidence table. She did not speak, but her attention was deliberate and precise. Every twitch of her ears, every blink, every subtle shift of weight communicated more than words could convey. The courtroom seemed to notice her even subconsciously. Observers found themselves drawn to her, their emotions quietly shaped by her presence. Rex, for his part, stood alert but calm, trained to ignore distractions. He had been brought as a demonstration, a living piece of evidence. His keen nose had uncovered the basement, his presence now silently validating the chain of events. While the jurors were instructed to focus on documented evidence, his calm, steady posture communicated an unspoken authority. The dog, silent yet powerful, became a subtle ally for the prosecution, embodying the truth that the adult mind sometimes struggled to articulate. The public gallery was packed. Friends, neighbors, journalists, and concerned citizens filled the benches, their murmurs punctuating the otherwise solemn silence. Cameras clicked, capturing images of the proceedings, while reporters scribbled furiously, aware that the moment might contain details that could dominate headlines for weeks. Whispers circulated. The girl's presence, the father's expression, the evidence of the basement. Everyone sensed the story would extend beyond the courtroom, shaping public perception and opinion before the first witness even took the stand. As the judge called the court to order, the murmur faded. The gavel struck with authority, and silence fell like a heavy curtain. The first speaker, the clerk, read the case details aloud: charges, defendant, location, and summary of the allegations. Even in this procedural step, tension was palpable. Every ear in the room seemed to strain toward the words, as though each syllable carried an invisible weight, each phrase tipping the balance of anticipation. The prosecution began its opening statement, Ellen Harris speaking with careful precision. She outlined the evidence collected from the basement, the significance of the photographs, weapons, and explosive devices, and the broader pattern of behavior that implicated the father. Her voice was steady, her tone measured, but the courtroom hung on every word. Even the defense team listened intently, aware that her narrative would frame the jury's perception before any witness was called. Meanwhile, the little girl's eyes remained fixed on her father and Rex. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a silent communication that seemed to bridge the gap between instinct and comprehension. She did not yet speak, but those who watched her closely, the social worker, the officers, even the jurors, could sense a profound understanding behind her expression. The child's body language, subtle as it was, reinforced the truth of what had happened in ways that paperwork and testimony could not. Livingston, the defense attorney, noticed the impact immediately. He attempted to redirect the jury's attention to technicalities, admissibility of evidence, procedural safeguards, and legal definitions. Yet even he could not prevent their subconscious awareness of the girl's presence. Every glance she threw toward her father seemed to amplify the prosecution's narrative. Every silent nod or blink underscored the gravity of the events under discussion. Throughout the morning, witnesses were called, neighbors who had heard the shouting, officers who had responded to the 911 call, and finally, the K-9 handler, Officer Miller, who recounted Rex's discovery of the hidden basement. The room leaned forward collectively, absorbing every detail. The father's demeanor shifted imperceptibly with each account, his calm facade fracturing as the weight of evidence, combined with the silent judgment of his daughter, pressed down on him. Coffee cups and notepads cluttered the counsel tables. Yet the atmosphere was far from mundane. Every gesture, every movement was scrutinized. The jurors scribbled notes, their pens scratching against paper like the heartbeat of the courtroom itself. Even the tiniest details, the direction of a gaze, a frown, a slight nod were noticed, recorded mentally, contributing to an invisible mosaic of impressions that would influence the eventual verdict. As the first half of the day progressed, The courtroom seemed to shrink and expand in rhythm with the tension. Time itself appeared to stretch. Moments became elongated as everyone awaited the next development, the next revelation, the next subtle cue that would tip the balance. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of dread, curiosity, and unspoken understanding that history small but significant was unfolding within these walls. By mid-afternoon, the trial had settled into a rhythm, though the intensity never waned. Witness after witness reinforced the prosecution's case. The evidence from the basement, meticulously documented and explained. And yet, despite the legal complexity, the room's emotional gravity was anchored in one simple truth: the presence of the child. Her small figure, hugging a stuffed rabbit, had become the silent compass guiding perception. Without uttering a single word, she shaped the atmosphere more than any witness testimony could. As the judge called for a brief recess, the tension momentarily released. Lawyers spoke in low voices, officers conferred quietly, and the little girl stood with her social worker. She glanced briefly at Rex, who wagged his tail faintly, and then toward her father, whose expression was a mixture of fear and disbelief. The break was brief, but in that time, the unspoken dynamics of power, innocence, and truth solidified further in the minds of everyone present. The courthouse corridors echoed with hushed conversations as people reflected on the morning's proceedings. Reporters speculated on the girl's potential impact on the jury. Officers discussed the evidence, and the defense recalculated strategy. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the storm of emotion and tension contained within the courtroom walls. As the participants returned from recess, the courtroom settled again into silence. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. This was not just a trial about stolen property, weapons, or explosives. It was a trial about truth, perception, and the indelible mark left by innocence confronting deception. The courtroom itself, with its polished floors and austere walls, seemed to pulse with the significance of what was about to unfold next. And in that charged atmosphere, the audience, jurors, attorneys, officers, and spectators remained keenly aware of one undeniable fact: tomorrow's proceedings would demand careful attention, for the smallest witness, the quietest observer, held a power that words alone could not capture. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm, the low hum of anticipation like a heartbeat filling the air. Every pair of eyes followed the proceedings with careful intensity, but beneath the formal motions and legal jargon, an undercurrent of attention had quietly shifted to the small figure in the corner, the 3-year-old girl, clutching her stuffed rabbit with unwavering focus. Her wide eyes darted from her father to the canine officer and back again, silently measuring the space between innocence and the darkness she had already witnessed. Throughout the morning, witnesses had delivered their statements with a clinical precision. Neighbors who had heard shouting, officers who described the initial raid, and the canine handler detailing Rex's discovery of the hidden basement. But no matter how damning the evidence, there remained a subtle emotional gap between testimony and truth. The little girl's presence now bridged that gap, unspoken yet profoundly tangible. Every subtle gesture she made adjusting her grip on the rabbit, tilting her head, shifting her gaze served as a silent confirmation of what the adults were recounting. The father sat rigid in his chair, hands clenched tightly in his lap. His public defender whispered reminders and legalese, but his eyes continually flicked toward the child. There was fear there now, not the bravado he had once relied upon. He could feel the weight of her observation as palpably as the gavel that rested above the judge's bench. For him, the courtroom was no longer a space of legal procedure. It had become an arena where the smallest witness carried the heaviest truth. Rex, the canine who had first uncovered the basement, stood silently beside Officer Miller. Trained to remain calm, the dog exuded an aura of quiet authority, a living testament to the chain of events that had brought the case into the courtroom. The little girl's eyes found Rex, and a flicker of recognition passed across her face. She knew. In her own childlike way, she understood the connection between the dog's presence and the danger she had survived. For a brief moment, it was as if Rex and the girl shared an unspoken conversation, an acknowledgement that the truth was finally in the open. The prosecutor, Ellen Harris, stepped forward for the next portion of the trial. She approached with measured confidence, her voice steady as she outlined the evidence yet again, emphasizing the timeline, the hidden basement, the weapons, and the stolen property. But even as she spoke, she was acutely aware of the child's presence. The little girl's gaze, fixed unwaveringly on her father, lent an authenticity to the narrative that words alone could not convey. Every juror in the room seemed to feel the emotional gravity of her attention, and Harris knew that the child's silent observation was as powerful as any formal testimony. Livingston, the defense attorney, attempted to interject. He pointed out technicalities, questioned procedures, and reminded the judge that the child was too young to comprehend the proceedings. But the courtroom was already under the sway of the subtle force the child represented. Her tiny presence was enough to punctuate every argument, to silently underscore the reality of the father's actions. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more the child's unspoken testimony disrupted it. Then it happened. The father shifted in his seat, attempting to lean slightly toward the defense table. His eyes, however, were drawn back to the little girl. He could see the way she focused on the canine, the way her small body stiffened with recognition. And in a moment that would freeze time in the courtroom, she raised her tiny hand and pointed toward Rex. Her finger, delicate yet unyielding, traced a line that connected innocence, fear, and truth. "Bad daddy," she said. The words were small, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken understanding. Every eye in the courtroom turned immediately toward her. The judge paused mid-breath, the gavel frozen above the bench. Attorneys, jurors, reporters, and spectators all stopped, suspended in a collective shock that rippled through the room. Silence enveloped the space like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating, yet charged with the electricity of revelation. The father's face paled, the color draining completely as he blinked in disbelief. He had never anticipated this. He had assumed that her age, her small size, would render her powerless in the courtroom. But in that instant, her words were more devastating than any prosecutor's argument, more undeniable than any evidence on the table. Her simple statement bypassed legal procedure entirely, striking directly at the core of the truth he had spent so long hiding. Even Rex seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The German shepherd's ears twitched, and he lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging the child's declaration. For those who understood canine behavior, it was a quiet but telling sign. The dog recognized the alignment between instinct and reality. The little girl had pointed, spoken, and connected the dots in a way that transcended law and reached straight into the human heart. The courtroom remained frozen for several seconds, each participant grappling with the impact of what had just occurred. The judge, composed but visibly affected, instructed the clerk to note the child's words in the record. She then reminded the room that the girl's statement could not be considered formal testimony, emphasizing the legal distinction, yet the emotional resonance lingered, palpable and undeniable. Harris, the prosecutor, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. While legally constrained, she understood the subtle power of the child's words. Every gesture, every glance, every breath taken by the little girl had reinforced the truth the evidence had already established. In this moment, the courtroom was not merely a venue for legal proceedings. It had become a stage where innocence, courage, and instinct converged to reveal reality in its rawest form. Livingston's protests seemed futile. He attempted to regain control, to redirect attention to procedural matters, but his words faltered against the quiet force of the child's declaration. The jury, trained to weigh evidence objectively, found themselves unconsciously swayed. Her words, simple yet profound, had inserted an undeniable emotional truth into the fabric of the trial. The technicalities of law could not erase the human response to a 3-year-old's recognition of right and wrong. The girl's hand remained raised briefly before she lowered it again, clutching her rabbit once more. Her face was calm, almost solemn, as if she understood the significance of what she had just said. Social workers and officers nearby exchanged glances, recognizing the bravery behind her actions. At 3 years old, she had not only survived terror, but had also conveyed its truth in a way that adults could neither fabricate nor ignore. Outside the formal proceedings, the courtroom audience murmured softly. Journalists scribbled rapidly, and cameras clicked in quiet anticipation of the story that would spread far beyond these walls. The words had traveled further than the child could comprehend, already shaping the narrative for a public eager to understand the human dimension behind the legal facts. For the father, however, the moment was catastrophic. His calculated detachment, the mask of control he had worn for years, crumbled entirely. The realization that his daughter had seen through him, that she had named him as the source of danger, pierced deeper than any legal sentence could. Fear, shame, and disbelief coalesced in a single expression, visible to all. Even as the judge moved to restore procedural order, the emotional impact lingered. Lawyers adjusted their approach, jurors scribbled notes with renewed intensity, and the courtroom itself seemed to absorb the tension, becoming a living witness to the confrontation between innocence and deception. The K-9 remained poised, a silent sentinel beside the evidence, emblematic of the events that had brought the case to this dramatic juncture. By mid-afternoon, the initial shock had settled into a tense acknowledgement of reality. Proceedings continued, but the echo of those 2 words, "Bad Daddy," resonated through every interaction, influencing perception, judgment, and emotion in subtle, unavoidable ways. The courtroom had shifted from a sterile arena of law to a space where truth was felt as much as it was examined. The little girl, for her part, remained largely silent after her declaration. She watched carefully, processed quietly, and clutched her rabbit with the same protective instinct that had carried her through the night of the incident. For her, it was not a performance. It was an honest acknowledgement of what she had experienced and what she understood. And in that moment, the trial transformed. It was no longer just about evidence, procedure, or strategy. It had become a story of courage, instinct, and the unflinching perception of a child who had witnessed danger and survived. The courtroom seemed to pause in a suspended moment, as though time itself had been caught in the grip of the child's words. "Bad Daddy?" 2 small syllables, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, yet charged with a weight that rippled across the room. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The judge, the jury, the attorneys, even the spectators, all were frozen, collectively absorbing the raw force of a 3-year-old's declaration. The judge's gavel hovered mid-air, waiting to restore order, but its authority felt diminished. The words were not evidence, at least not formally, yet they resonated in a way that no legal instruction could counteract. The child's small finger had pointed, her voice had named the danger, and the room itself seemed to lean closer to acknowledge her truth. The father sat frozen, eyes wide with shock. His carefully constructed mask of control had shattered in an instant. He had relied on procedure, on legal safeguards, on the presumed irrelevance of a toddler's perception. But he underestimated her. He had forgotten, as adults often do, that innocence could be sharper than the sharpest argument, more revealing than the clearest photograph, more disarming than any line of defense. The jurors exchanged glances, some unconsciously nodding, some scribbling notes with pens shaking slightly. The child's words, though not admissible as testimony, carried a silent weight that infused the entire room with unspoken understanding. Each juror felt it differently, yet none could ignore it. The subtle power of a small, perceptive witness had inserted itself into the deliberative process, quietly influencing perception even as the formal procedures continued. Rex, the K-9, stood calmly beside Officer Miller, his presence grounding the tension in the room. Though the dog did not comprehend legal proceedings, his stillness and attention seemed to reinforce the reality of the situation. The connection between him and the child was unmistakable. To anyone watching closely, it was as if the dog acknowledged her words, his posture a silent confirmation of truth. The prosecutor, Ellen Harris, took a steadying breath and resumed her place at the front of the courtroom. She had practiced restraint, knowing the jury would be swayed not just by documents and testimony, but by the emotional currents swirling invisibly in the room. Her strategy was now subtly reinforced by the child's reaction. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, resonated differently in light of the quiet proclamation that had just occurred. The defense attorney, Marcus Livingston, shifted. In his seat, frowning. He had anticipated emotional influence, but had not foreseen the undeniable impact of a small child speaking so plainly. He rose to remind the court that the child's statement could not be considered evidence. He cited precedents, legal protections, and procedural rules. But even as he spoke, the jurors' focus lingered on the child. Livingston's carefully measured objections seemed faint, almost trivial, against the raw authenticity of what had just transpired. For the little girl, the moment was brief, almost inconsequential in her own understanding. She lowered her tiny hand and hugged her, grabbed it tightly as if nothing had happened. Her wide eyes scanned the room, taking in her father, the dog, the judge, and the rows of spectators. She did not fully comprehend the significance of her words, yet she understood, in the simplest and most profound way, that she had spoken a truth that mattered. The silence persisted longer than anyone expected. Officers shifted slightly, journalists adjusted cameras, the judge composed herself, but the courtroom remained steeped in tension. There was a collective awareness that the procedural flow of the trial had been punctuated, perhaps irreversibly, by a human truth that was neither controlled nor scripted. The words "bad daddy" had carved a fissure through the courtroom's formal structure, creating a space where emotion, instinct, and innocence dominated over logic and argument. Outside the formal proceedings, the courtroom spectators murmured. Softly, cameras clicked, some reporters scribbled notes, others whispered to neighbors or colleagues. Social workers watched the child closely, ensuring that the event did not overwhelm her, yet they too recognized the extraordinary moment. The girl's simple declaration had become the emotional pivot of the trial, a force that subtly yet inexorably influenced every perception in the room. The father's face told the story more clearly than any witness could. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted nervously, and he seemed to shrink in his seat under the weight of the child's unfiltered perception. His calculated detachment, his attempts at authority, and his reliance on procedure were rendered nearly irrelevant by the raw clarity of her observation. In that moment, the legal battle became as much psychological as it was procedural. The jury, meanwhile, could not help but process the emotional context the child introduced. Even those trained to weigh facts objectively sensed the shift. Her words, though brief, carried implications beyond simple accusation. They conveyed fear, recognition, and instinctive judgment. The subtle cues, the angle of her gaze, the firmness of her pointing finger, The calm confidence of her voice formed an invisible narrative that ran parallel to the formal evidence being presented. Officers Miller and Daniels, who had been present from the initial incident, exchanged a glance. They had seen the girl in moments of fear and silence during the basement discovery, yet nothing compared to this. The courtroom reaction confirmed what they already suspected. The child's presence, her perceptions, and her instincts were profoundly impactful, shaping the courtroom environment in ways that no testimony could replicate. As the judge instructed the court to move forward, the tension did not dissipate entirely. Every word spoken thereafter carried an undercurrent of awareness, the knowledge that a child had spoken truth into the room, unfiltered, uncoached, and undeniable. The atmosphere remained charged, a blend of anticipation, respect, and subdued awe. The little girl's silence after her declaration was as powerful as the words themselves. She did not seek attention, nor did she react to the sudden focus. She simply observed, her small body poised, her eyes bright and watchful. Her quiet presence reinforced the emotional and moral gravity of the case. And even as formal testimony continued, it became impossible to separate the courtroom proceedings from the truth she had so simply and courageously voiced. The courtroom itself seemed to carry the echo of her words. Spectators leaned forward unconsciously. Attorneys adjusted arguments with heightened sensitivity, and jurors recorded every motion and reaction with new awareness. The event was subtle, yet undeniable. The innocence of a child had altered the emotional architecture of the trial. The interplay between law and human perception, fact and instinct, was now inseparable. Outside, reporters began to speculate quietly about the significance of the child's declaration. Social media murmurs, though officially restricted, buzzed with fascination as staff in nearby offices whispered about the courtroom drama. The story had shifted from abstract legal proceedings to a narrative of human courage, instinct, and the extraordinary impact of a 3-year-old witness. By mid-afternoon, proceedings resumed with witness testimony and evidence presentation, but the memory of the child's words lingered in every corner. The father, increasingly aware of the influence, shifted uneasily in his seat. Defense strategies became defensive rather than assertive, attempting to counteract an emotional truth that could not be undone. Every gesture, every glance, every note taken by the jury now carried the subtle imprint of her declaration. And as the court moved toward the end of the day, there was an unspoken acknowledgement among all adults present. The trial would be remembered not merely for evidence or procedure, but for a singular moment of clarity, courage, and innocence that had pierced the formal structure of justice. The little girl, still clutching her rabbit, had not only named the danger she had faced, she had redefined the courtroom's atmosphere. Silence, in this instance, was not emptiness. It was a weighty, palpable presence that demanded recognition. It spoke louder than any legal argument, resonating through every observer, silently affirming what had been uncovered, the undeniable truth of the father's actions, seen through the eyes of a child. By the time the courtroom recessed, the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Witnesses, attorneys, jurors, and spectators left with a shared, unspoken understanding. This trial was no longer merely a legal proceeding. It had become a human story, anchored by innocence, courage, and a truth so stark that it could not be ignored. And in that heavy, lingering silence, the room seemed to collectively acknowledge what the child already knew. Her words, simple though they were, had changed everything. The courtroom had emptied for the day, but the echoes of the little girl's declaration, "Bad Daddy," still lingered in the minds of everyone present. Behind the heavy wooden doors, the jury retired to deliberate, carrying with them not only the weight of evidence and testimony, but also the subtle, undeniable force of a child's perception. Each juror settled into their seats around the long table. Notebooks, evidence folders, and pens laid before them like instruments of judgment. Outside, the city carried on unaware of the tension rippling behind closed doors. At first, the deliberation began in procedural form. Jurors reviewed the evidence systematically: the weapons, the stolen property, the surveillance photos, and the explosive devices. They recounted witness statements: neighbors who had heard shouting, officers who had discovered the basement, and the K-9 handler who described Rex's pivotal role. Every fact was catalogued, every timeline reconstructed, and every detail scrutinized. This was supposed to be a measured, rational process. Yet no amount of procedure could erase the memory of the child's declaration. "I keep thinking about what she said," murmured juror number 3, a middle-aged schoolteacher, her fingers nervously tapping the table. "It's not evidence, I know, but there's something about it. She wasn't coached. She wasn't trying to influence anyone. She just spoke the truth." Juror number 7, a retired firefighter, nodded slowly. "I feel the same way. She's 3 years old, but she's seen what's happened. And somehow that matters. You can't just ignore it." The jurors spent hours debating, balancing cold facts with instinctive understanding. They revisited each exhibit, replayed witness testimonies in their minds, and considered the forensic reports. Yet in every discussion, the child's quiet presence resonated. Her words had cut through the formalities of law, reminding them that the heart of the case was not only evidence, but also lived experience, the experience of a small child navigating danger. They spoke cautiously about the father. His demeanor in the courtroom had been calculated, trying to appear composed, but the jurors remembered the way he had reacted when the child spoke. Fear, disbelief, and shame had flickered across his face. That reaction alone, though not evidence in a legal sense, contributed to their perception of his guilt. It painted a picture that went beyond documents and photos. It revealed a human truth. Rex's presence in the courtroom, though silent, had also left its mark. Several jurors mentioned it in passing. The dog. "I don't know why, but I can't get past the fact that he found the basement," one juror said. "He's trained, yes, but the way the girl looked at him, she trusted him, and that tells me something." The conversation shifted to the risks the child had faced. They considered the weapons, the explosives, the surveillance equipment items no 3-year-old should have been exposed to. They spoke quietly, almost reverently, about her courage, about her ability to witness danger and survive. And in doing so, they acknowledged the subtle, undeniable influence her presence had exerted on their deliberation. Hours passed. Arguments were made, opinions shifted, and jurors wrestled with their sense of responsibility. They examined the father's actions, the pattern of deception, and the sheer scale of the crimes uncovered in the basement. Yet for all the facts, the emotional thread remained. The small child's words had humanized the case in a way no piece of evidence could replicate. Some jurors struggled with the technicality. "Legally, we're supposed to consider only admissible evidence," one said. "Her words aren't testimony. They can't technically count. But how do you ignore the truth in them?" "That's exactly it," another juror replied. "We're not ignoring evidence. We're acknowledging reality. She's lived it. And if that doesn't count for something, then what does?" The debate continued late into the evening. Jurors revisited the basement photographs, the evidence logs, the witness statements, and the child's silent presence in the courtroom. They spoke of her pointing at Rex, of the conviction in her tiny voice, of the clarity with which she had identified danger. It was an influence that transcended legal definitions, yet it was undeniable. Finally, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation, a consensus emerged. The jurors were unanimous in their assessment. They recognized the weight of evidence, the chain of custody of materials, and the corroborating witness testimonies. They also acknowledged the intangible, yet undeniable truth conveyed by the child's presence, the instinctive, clear-eyed perception of someone who had witnessed the danger firsthand. The foreperson, a soft-spoken woman with careful eyes, called the group to order. Papers were gathered, pens clicked, and notes were prepared. They would return to the courtroom and deliver a decision that, in its essence, reflected not only the legal facts, but also the profound impact of lived experience. The father was led back into the courtroom. He wore a mask of composure, though jurors remembered the tremor in his hands, the flicker of fear in his eyes when the child had spoken. The room was silent, heavy with anticipation. Spectators leaned forward. Reporters scribbled notes. Even the judge seemed to sense that this was more than a procedural moment. It was the culmination of truth, courage, and instinct converging. The foreperson handed the verdict to the judge. She cleared her throat and announced, voice steady, but carrying a weight that resonated through the room. On the charges presented, we the jury find the defendant guilty on all counts. The room gasped softly. The words reverberated against the walls. The father slumped slightly in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor. The little girl, clutching her rabbit, looked up briefly, her gaze meeting her father's. There was no triumph in her expression, only the calm acknowledgement that the truth had been seen and recognized. Rex, standing silently, seemed to exhale, in the way only a trained dog could, as though sensing the resolution of the danger he had once detected. Officer Miller gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, acknowledging the quiet but profound role the dog had played in ensuring justice. The courtroom remained heavy with emotion. Reporters whispered to one another, jurors exchanged discreet glances, and the judge banged her gavel to restore order. The verdict, though formal, carried layers of meaning that extended beyond paperwork and procedure. It represented the acknowledgement of danger, courage, and truth as recognized by a small child and a loyal canine. As the courtroom emptied, the little girl was gently led from the room by her social worker. Her rabbit remained firmly in her grasp, a comfort and a constant in a world that had suddenly grown overwhelmingly complex. For her, the verdict was abstract, but she sensed a shift in the energy around her, a resolution of danger she could not have fully articulated, yet deeply understood. The father was escorted back to custody, head bowed, every step a reminder of his exposure and the clarity with which the child had revealed his actions. Legal counsel followed, preparing for appeals, motions, and procedural steps, but the emotional reality had already been determined in that room. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, eager to report the outcome, to capture the human drama behind the legal proceedings. They spoke of stolen property, weapons, and explosives, but many also noted the extraordinary influence of the child's presence. How a small voice, spoken in innocence, could cut through the complexity of law and reach straight to the hearts and minds of adults. For those who had been in the courtroom, the memory lingered. The child's words, her gaze, and her instinctive understanding remained imprinted in their minds. Justice had been served, but it was colored, nuanced, and humanized by the presence of someone so small, yet profoundly perceptive. And as the day ended, the little girl returned to foster care, her world calm once more, yet irrevocably changed. She had spoken truth, altered the course of events, and influenced justice in a way that no adult could replicate. In her quiet way, she had taught everyone in that room the extraordinary power of perception, courage, and honesty. The courtroom had delivered a verdict, but the story of that child's bravery, her unwavering gaze, and her simple yet profound words, "Bad Daddy," would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse, echoing in hearts, minds, and the very conscience of those who had witnessed her truth. The courthouse had emptied, leaving behind echoes of footsteps and whispered conversations, but the weight of the trial lingered like a shadow. Outside, The sun slanted through the tall city buildings, casting long, golden streaks across the sidewalks, indifferent to the dramas of human lives. For the little girl, the trial was over, but its effects remained. Though she did not fully understand the complexity of the verdict, she sensed the change. The presence of danger had been acknowledged, the fear she had lived through recognized, and justice had been delivered in a way that her small voice had helped shape. Foster care staff guided her gently through the courthouse doors. The child's grip on her war rabbit was firm, her small hands holding tightly as if to carry a piece of stability into the uncertain world outside. The social worker, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, knelt to her level and offered a reassuring smile. "It's over now," Clara said. "You're safe." The girl nodded quietly, her expression calm but introspective, reflecting a maturity forged not through age, but through experience. The father, meanwhile, had been escorted to a secure facility to begin serving his sentence. His public defender had already begun drafting appeals, but those documents seemed inconsequential in the face of the living truth that had unraveled in the courtroom. His reputation, once carefully curated, lay in ruins, shattered by evidence, witness testimony, and most unexpectedly, by the words of a 3-year-old. The magnitude of his exposure was as psychological as it was legal. He had been seen, truly seen, and the consequences were irreversible. Back at the police department, Rex, the K-9, received quiet praise from his handler, Officer Miller. The dog's discovery of the basement had not only revealed hidden dangers, but had also indirectly facilitated the clarity of the child's declaration. For those who understood the subtle dynamics between human and canine, it was a confirmation of instinct aligning with truth. Rex wagged his tail faintly, unaware of the larger ramifications, yet undeniably part of the chain of events that had culminated in justice. The media coverage that followed was intense but careful. Journalists highlighted the discovery of weapons and explosives, the extensive evidence of identity theft, and the father's calculated attempts to conceal his actions. Yet among the headlines, the child's pivotal role could not be ignored. Stories focused on the bravery of a small witness, the presence of the K-9 who had revealed the hidden basement, and the courtroom moment that had resonated far beyond formal legal proceedings. Social media buzzed with discussions, some praising her courage, others marveling at the quiet, extraordinary power of a child's voice. For the foster family who had temporarily taken her in, life became a delicate balancing act. They provided stability, routine, and comfort, attempting to shield her from the attention that followed the trial. But even within the quiet walls of home, her experiences echoed. She occasionally stared at her stuffed rabbit with intent, revisiting the basement memories, the barking of the dog, and the tense courtroom atmosphere. She had witnessed fear and danger, yet she had also discovered a personal strength that neither the adults around her nor the world beyond could diminish. Therapy sessions became a consistent part of her life. Child psychologists helped her process the events, to understand that fear was normal but not defining, that danger had been real, yet now was contained, and that her voice, though small, had shaped the course of justice. She learned to articulate emotions in ways she had previously relied on instinct to express. Gradually, she began to trust adults not only to protect her, but to recognize her perceptive awareness. Each session reinforced a critical truth. Her insight mattered, and the courage she had displayed was valid and powerful. School, when she eventually began to attend, introduced another layer of adjustment. Teachers and classmates were initially curious, some whispering about her past, some genuinely admiring her bravery. Clara and the foster parents worked closely with school staff to create a supportive environment, emphasizing normalcy while validating the child's experience. Gradually, she adapted, finding comfort in routine, friendships, and the safety of spaces where she could explore without fear. The courtroom itself, though distant now, left an indelible mark. Jurors, reporters, and spectators continued to reflect on the trial's unusual and poignant moments. Legal scholars discussed the case in articles and seminars, noting the subtle influence of witness presence, even when formal testimony was absent. Officers who had participated reflected privately on the extraordinary nature of the child's perception, and on the alignment of instinct, courage, and evidence that had brought the case to resolution. The father's incarceration became a quiet background reality. He faced the consequences of his actions, navigating the prison system while grappling with the reality that his crimes, though meticulously concealed, had been revealed in the most profound and personal of ways. The small voice he had underestimated, the K-9 who had discovered the basement, and the meticulous investigation combined to expose a life built on secrecy and control. In prison, he was left to contemplate not just the legal consequences, but the human truth that had confronted him so starkly in the courtroom. Months later, the little girl's life began to stabilize further. She developed small routines, mourning, walks with her foster family, drawing and coloring sessions that allowed her to express her feelings, bedtime stories that fostered imagination rather than fear. Each activity was carefully structured to restore normalcy and reinforce a sense of safety. Yet within her, the memory of courage endured a quiet strength that reminded her that even the smallest voice could affect the largest change. Community support emerged unexpectedly. Neighbors, local organizations, and even the police department reached out with kind gestures, small gifts, letters of encouragement, and recognition of her bravery. These acts were never about glorifying her role, but about acknowledging that courage, insight, and honesty were qualities worth honoring, regardless of age. Over time, the child began to internalize the reassurance, understanding that she was seen, valued, and protected. The story of the trial, though widely reported, gradually shifted from sensational headlines to deeper reflection. Books, podcasts, and articles highlighted the intersection of justice, innocence, and human perception. Scholars analyzed the psychological dimensions, while ordinary citizens found inspiration in the narrative of a small child whose courage transcended age. And through all of this, the girl's life moved forward, her growth continuing quietly, but profoundly, shaped by experiences that would always inform her understanding of trust, safety, and moral clarity. Years later, she would remember the trial not as a source of fear, but as a defining moment of resilience. She would recall the dog's steadfast presence, the seriousness of the courtroom, and the significance of speaking truth even when the world seemed vast and complicated. Those memories became embedded in her sense of self, guiding her moral compass and shaping her understanding of courage, integrity, and the power of perception. The K-9 unit continued its work, Rex eventually retiring with honor, remembered, not only as a skilled police dog, but as a silent participant in one of the most extraordinary cases in the department's history. Officers often recounted this story to new recruits, emphasizing teamwork, observation, and the subtle yet critical impact of intuition. Rex's legacy, intertwined with the child's bravery, became a quiet legend within the department. And for the little girl, life after the verdict was not defined by fear or trauma, but by resilience, love, and the enduring truth that her voice had mattered. In the quiet moments, as she hugged her rabbit, drew pictures, or walked through the park, she carried with her the certainty that courage, honesty, and perception, no matter how small the source, could reshape the world around her. The city, unaware in its daily rhythm, had witnessed the profound impact of one child's words. The courthouse, the officers, the jurors, and the public had all felt the quiet force of truth spoken plainly. And though the father's life was irrevocably altered, the child's life had been fortified. Her understanding of justice and safety deepened, and her courage preserved as a beacon for all who would come to learn her story. Life moved on, as it always does, but the memory of that trial, the silent observation, the small declaration, and the unwavering bravery remained, a testament to the extraordinary capacity of even the youngest among us to recognize danger, act courageously, and influence the course of justice in ways that no adult, no law, and no system could fully anticipate.